Crocheting Neckline Edges for Knitters by Kate Oates. The patterns referenced in this tutorial are from my pink fluff set, and they're called Lacy Fluff and Ruffle Fluff. You can find them on my website, Ravelry, or all the other places where my downloads are sold. In this video, I'm going to be teaching you how to crochet a neckline using a slip stitch chain one edge.
It gives such a nice clean finish, and that's just really what I wanted for my two pink fluffy patterns. This is Lacy Fluff because it's got the color blocking and the lace at the bottom, and then also my Ruffle Fluff. So in this design, these stitches in the front would be picked up and knit normally,
but we're going to crochet into them instead.
And then the cast on stitches here would be live stitches on our needle. So I'm going to use two different swatches to show you how to do it both with live stitches and with stitches that you would normally be picking up and knitting. In both of the Ruffle Fluff and Lacy Fluff patterns, there are instructions for an alternate I-cord bind off edging if crochet hooks just aren't your thing. The other thing to pay attention to is that this kind of neckline is going to not have as much stretch or give as an I-cord neckline. So when we're practicing and when I'm demonstrating, I'll show you how to kind of get enough fabric in there to make sure that your neckline will fit over your head. But if you're really struggling and you keep ending up with too small of a neckline, you should go ahead and try that I-cord bind off as an alternative. It's going to look very similar than this. It'll just take a little bit longer to do. All right, so the very first thing that we are going to do before we begin is we're going to make a slip knot. And we're going to place that slip knot on your crochet hook and snug it up a little bit. Doesn't need to be super tight, and I'm going to talk about how we want to keep your yarn loose in a minute, but this is how we will begin before picking up your stitches that are on working needles. So this stitch holder represents the stitches that are on your working needles, and the reason they're on your working needles and they're live stitches is because they were provisionally cast on. So at this point in the pattern, you've removed your provisional cast on and you've placed your stitches on your needles, ready to work the right side. As with pretty much any neckline I can think of, you will always be approaching, picking up these stitches from the right side. So the right side should always be facing you. So once I've got my slip knot on, I'm going to slide my stitches towards the end of my needle / holder. And step one is going to be inserting your crochet hook as if to knit into the first stitch on your working needles. The next step is going to be making a loop where you go from right to left behind your crochet hook, and you will pull that loop through so that it comes over top of the stitch that's on your needle. At this point, you can slide your stitch off, and now we're going to pull that loop we made through our first loop on the needle. So that's part one of working the first stitch. Part two is super important, and it's something that sometimes knitters who aren't crocheters like myself forget. But part two, before moving on to our next stitch, is we're actually going to need to make another loop in the same way around our crochet hook and pull that through as well. So really, we're creating almost like 2 stitches for every 1 stitch that's on our needles. This is really important because this allows your neckline to have some extra flexibility, to have enough stitches in it. And the other thing that's really important with that I'm going to show specifically when we work this next stitch is you want to wrap your yarn kind of loosely when you're wrapping it around your crochet hook. So once again, I will insert my crochet hook as if to knit into the live stitch. I will wrap my yarn from right to left behind the crochet hook. And this is where I'm talking about, obviously it needs to be tight enough that it's not going to fall off your needle, but the looser it will be, the better flexibility your neckline will have. So then I'm going to pull that stitch through, slide it off the needle. I'm going to deal with these 2 loops by passing one over, and I'm going to then work another loop around my crochet hook and pass that through. So you can see the beginnings here of our neckline edging. And the next thing I want to show you is how, if you're having trouble with just using your crochet hook to get those loops pulled over, you can actually use your needle to help you. So we're going to do the same thing, insert the crochet hook, wrap it around, pull it through the stitch, slide the stitch off the needle, and this time, instead of just using my crochet hook, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my needle to go into the first loop, now slide it up the crochet hook, and I'm going to pass the loop over that way. So again, if you're not really super familiar with crochet and you're having trouble handling that crochet hook, that tip can really help you out. And then I'm going to, once again, wrap my yarn around the crochet hook and pull it through before moving it on to the next stitch. Now let me show you one more time how you can use your needle to help you. Inserting the crochet hook as if to knit, loosely wrapping that yarn around your crochet hook, sliding it through, and then letting your stitch drop off the needle. Insert your needle into the bottom loop and use it to help you pass that loop over your crochet hook. Now it's time to do that extra loop, and you can do the same thing here. You can use your knitting needle here as well, as long as you are keeping that yarn not too tight. The last 3 stitches, I'm going to show you how to work this a little bit faster by combining some of the steps. So this time I'm going to insert my crochet hook, wrap my yarn around, and this time when I pull through the loop, I'm going to do the rest of the maneuvers pretty much one on top of each other. So sliding through, allowing that yarn to come off, and immediately passing my loop over. So let me show you that one more time. But first, we make our extra loop. So this is, again, once you get comfortable and you're making sure to keep your stitches not too tight there, you can combine these maneuvers so that you're not doing everything one step at a time. So I've got my yarn wrapped, I'm ready to go. Going to pull this through, continue to pull it through. At the same time, I'm going to let my stitch slide off the needle. Going to wrap and make my extra loop. And we'll just finish our very last stitch on this swatch, and then we'll move on to our next swatch. Wrap the yarn around, go ahead and start pulling loops, and slide it off the needle. Now, I'm going to leave this connected because on your project, you have just a single loop that you're going around the whole neckline, so you wouldn't have 2 separate projects. All right, so now that we've got our nice edge here on the straight piece, we're going to leave this loop on our crochet hook and we're going to go directly to this next piece. First, let me talk a little bit about this next piece and then we'll continue. So this is just going to be on the front of your neckline because this is where you are actually going to be inserting into your project as opposed to actually working with a stitch that's already on your needle. Because of the snugness of this method, I will recommend that you pick up every stitch that you can. So, whereas normally it might be pick up 3 stitches every 4 rows or something like that, for this particular method, go ahead and use every single stitch that you see. So with all that in mind, you are going to have one piece of fabric. You're not going to be joining pieces of fabric as I am, but I just figured this way I could show you the continuous looping instead of switching to a new piece. So I have a single loop on my crochet hook, and this is left from working those provisionally cast on stitches. You have 3 options when it comes to picking up and knitting your stitches. The first thing that you could choose to do is to set your crochet hook to the side and use your working needle to go into each of these stitches, placing live stitches on your working needle to take out the step of inserting your crochet hook directly. If you do that method, just make sure that you're not picking up and knitting those stitches. You would simply be inserting your working needle into each loop, just a single loop if you do that method. The second option that you have is to pick up 2 loops if you're using your crochet hook and use that. And that looks like going into both of these outer loops and having 2 loops on your neckline edge. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute when I'm actually performing the neckline crochet. But the third option, and this is my preferred option, is to only use a single loop when you insert your crochet hook. The reason why I prefer this for this neckline work is that you want to preserve as much flexibility in the fabric of the sweater itself as you can. And if you insert into 2 loops, that's just going to take away a little bit of the stretchiness of your garment. So I would really recommend only using that single loop to pick up and knit your stitches. But if you are more comfortable using both loops, by all means do it. So this probably looks pretty familiar, right? This is just like before. We have 1 loop, that's our stitch. We have our crocheted loop at the bottom, and we are going to do exactly the same thing. We are going to wrap our yarn around our crochet hook. We are going to pull through that single stitch, and then we're going to pull through the loop that's on our crochet hook. This first one's a little trickier because it's dangling next to that fabric. And then before moving on to the next stitch, we will wrap, create 1 more second half of our single crochet, and now we're set up to go into the next loop. So we'll do that the same way. We'll just go into 1 loop, wrap our yarn around the crochet hook, pull it through the loop, and again, see how I have like length there and I'm not making these loops super tight? That's really important in terms of making sure your neckline is going to fit over your head. Then we're going to pull that loop through. And finally, we will create the second half of that stitch. And I will admit that when you are holding the yarn a little bit more loosely, it does make it a little bit trickier to pull through your loops and not lose any, but it's worth the effort. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate with 2 loops just so that you can see what that looks like. So if I go through 2 loops, then I will wrap my yarn just like before, but this time when I pull my loop through, it needs to go through both of those loops. And then through our crochet loop, then we wrap and create that final stitch. Now, of course, just as with the original swatch piece, once you get more comfortable with this process, you can do these 2 steps at once by pulling through that loop and going straight into getting your neckline actually down to the 1 loop again. Then you'll wrap around and pull that loop through. Let's do it one more time. So, and if you're ever getting confused about if you worked into a stitch or not, you can just look at where the yarn is. So I can tell this last stitch is actually, it's part of this one right here. I'm trying to make it so it's not fuzzy. So this is actually attached to this loop, which lets me know the next loop that I need to address is this guy right here. Wrap, pull through, wrap, pull through. So there you go.
That's how you do the slip 1, chain 1 combination crochet neckline.
Once you have gotten to your very last stitch, all you're going to do, pull your crochet hook out, break your yarn, weave it through that last stitch, and weave in your loose ends. Because you're going in a circle, the nice thing is if you leave a nice long tail, you can actually sew the beginning of your circle to the back of your circle. This would be our beginning over here. Let's say this made a circle. There would be a little gap in between where we began and where we finished. And so if you leave a nice tail, you can close that gap with yarn. Not hard. And again, it makes this beautiful, clean neckline edge.
Visit my website for a huge variety of knitting patterns for babies through Centennial Wonders, supplemented by free knitting tutorials to help you make the most of each project. As a designer, nothing brings me greater joy than seeing happy knitters wearing pieces that fit. The community of Oates knitters is wonderful and full of folks ready to help you hone your skills and be more satisfied with every knit you finish as you grow in your knit life. We would love for you to come and join us.